I do think that, there have always in Kenya been stories of the killer cop. It wasn't until there was, when it was in broad daylight, that people started going like, this cannot happen in Kenya, this is not Uganda. It's always been happening in Kenya. There's stories of lone wolf. I forget the name of the police officer. I believe his name was Ian someone. I forget the name.
I think he was actually released. I think the charges against him were dropped literally yesterday. The guy in Isili.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly. These sorts of infrastructures have existed and have long life worlds of their own. There has always been the rogue killer cop, going back all the way into the 60s. You might decide to go back even as far as the war on Mau Mau, where there was, Ian Henderson would just walk into the forest and shoot whoever he saw on sight. These sorts of, they have always existed. I don't think that the exceptionalist narrative that Kenyans craft for themselves is the reason why they exist. But I do think, being the country that has been the darling of the West, you might imagine, for instance, you might call to mind, I believe it is the American ambassador 2 weeks ago saying, anytime America wants to do something in Africa, we start in Kenya first.
Welcome, viewers and listeners, to A Certain Amount of Madness. I'm your host, Mamka Anyona. I am joined in studio today by Samar Al-Bulushi, who is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, Irvine, and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, and Rene Odanga, who is a PhD candidate in African history at Emory University. And we will be having a discussion today based on Samar's book, War Making as World Making: Kenya, the United States, and the War on Terror. I will start with you, Samar. Welcome. And please introduce yourself as well to our guests as you answer my first question, which will come to you, which is to offer us a summary of the book and in the context, or to set up the context for this conversation. And in so doing, please say something about Kenya's growing role as a sub-imperial nation, and its growing militarism and its excursions beyond the borders of the continent, and the ways in which this has also interacted with a growing militarism across the continent. Welcome, Samar.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here with you. And just to introduce myself, I am an associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. I also am a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And it's really, truly an honor to be in dialogue with both of you today about this book, which has been a work in progress for, we could say, almost 15 years. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of what the book is about, I'm broadly interested in Kenya's relationship to the United States in the context of the war on terror. So my focus is primarily on the security partnerships between the two countries. And by virtue of the fact that I'm trying to bring Kenya and the United States into one single analytic frame, I'm pushing back against the tendency amongst quite a number of scholars to focus only on the confines of the Kenyan state, what some people would refer to as methodological nationalism, wherein we kind of forget about the broader dynamics that inevitably shape decision-making within Kenya itself. And US empire is one such broader dynamic. We could take British colonialism as a more historical dynamic that continues to shape Kenyan politics today. And I am interested in the extent to which Kenya has become what we might refer to as a junior partner in US empire. You use the term sub-imperial actor. And I think perhaps what's most important here is not necessarily the term we use, but to think about the political impact of this kind of partnership and the political impact of Kenya and Kenyan political leaders being given a platform to exert its power beyond its borders, right? As well as to expand its policing authority within its borders. So the primary focus of the book is on the impact of this partnership, primarily on members of Kenya's Muslim minority population.
Mm-hmm.
I focused mainly on the Muslim population on the coast in Mombasa, as well as in Nairobi. And another broader element, of course, is what it means that Kenya has now been engaged in what we might refer to as an seemingly endless war in Somalia. And then I conclude the book by thinking about the more recent instantiation of Kenya's adventurous forms of militarism in Haiti, with the decision to deploy police and to lead a multinational police operation in Haiti. So part of what I'm trying to do is to insist that we expand our geographic sense of the impact, of the human impact of the so-called war on terror. And by this, I mean that there's a tendency, even amongst scholars, analysts, journalists who are writing critically about the effects of the war on terror in different parts of the world, there's a tendency amongst those analysts to focus primarily in places that have been on the receiving end of spectacular instantiations of violence, primarily in the form of bombs and drone strikes. Kenya does not fit that mold, right? In the sense that it hasn't been the target of bombing or drone strikes, but nonetheless, the impact on the Kenyan population, the Muslim population primarily, cannot be understated in terms of the ways in which their day-to-day lives have been fundamentally transformed, the calculations they have to make, thinking about the potential that they will be apprehended, killed by Kenyan police forces that have been extensively trained and funded by the United States. So perhaps I'll leave it there for now.
Great. Thank you so much. So I will come to you, Rene, with the second question. And I think the question will build from where Samar has stopped. That what she's basically set up is that the global war on terror had its own manifestation on the continent, with Kenya being one of the leading sort of countries taking on that sub-imperial role in defending the world from terrorism, but that the impact of this has it has been majorly felt by the Muslim population in Kenya. But the Muslim population in Kenya, which is mostly in the coast and in northern Kenya, has a very interesting and complex sort of racial history, because in very many ways, those are, the racial history sort of, it sort of transcends the idea of Africanism when we think about what an African racial sort of makeup is. And that has also, there's also been a transition in that sort of perception of racialization of these groups through history, since before colonization, during the colonial era, post-colonization, and then in this particular era that was analyzed by this book. And so maybe speak to us a little bit about the way that race has played into this whole, internal and external war and terror as perpetuated by Kenya.
Oh, thank you so much.
And begin by introducing yourself, please.
I will. I'm Rene Odanga. I am a PhD candidate in African history at Emory University. I mostly study the 19th century. So when you ask me about the problems of racialization and in terms of what I would say, what becomes Kenya, I am thinking about that northern, quote unquote, frontier district as it becomes securitized in the later years. But what comes to mind, for instance, for me is there's a particular colonial administrator I'm a little bit obsessed with. His name is Arthur Hardinge, and sometime in around 1898, he writes a letter to a colonial administrator in Whitehall in London, and it essentially titles it The Philosophy of Force, where he's explaining that, to his mind, the administration of that region, the broader Ogaden coming down into what later on becomes northeastern Kenya, cannot be administered by anything else other than the sword. So he says quite outrightly, he's actually chastising Clement Hill and telling him, I'm worried that you rather kick at the idea of going in there guns blazing And he spends the remaining 2 years of his career begging London to give him more ammunition and more men to allow him an incursion into the northern part of what was at the time called British East Africa. London is unwilling because they know that Ethiopia had walloped the Italians, so they don't want to go in and meet a force that is more prepared for them than they thought. But eventually he gets his wish, and he's able to go in with spectacular amounts of violence, so on and so forth. However, from my perspective as somebody who studies this period and who then lives in this one, I am sort of seeing a very long, I don't want to say continuity because historians tend to run away from the word continuity, but there is a sort of pattern that the northern part of this territory is always going to be a part of the world, a part of their world that has a problem that needs to be solved. So whilst, I came of age in the years of the parliamentary debates on should we do Operation Linda or Salam or Linda Nchi or not. I sort of remember Yusuf Haji standing around in parliament and saying things like Al-Shabaab is a snake with its body in Somalia and its head in Isili. I sort of, I remember sort of these things. But really, when you listen to the discourse, you almost feel yourself being back into 1970s shifter war propaganda, which is to mean that there has always been sort of an administrative sense that there's something that goes on in that part of the world that needs help, and that solution only comes through the wielding of state violence. And so I definitely see a racializing aspect in it, but an internal one. It is an internal conversation. What do we do with the population we have over there that sometimes succumbs to irredentist narratives of the greater Somalia state, when really this is our land? We will go the Kenyatta route and securitize the hell out of it, which is sort of, to my mind, I sort of see it in this broad conversation of whatever problems the administration, the colonial state, the post-colonial state, the present-day state, if at all we shall call it post-colonial in any way, shape or form, has always seen itself to have a problem with that part of the world, with that part of its world, and that part of its world is first and foremost solved through immense amounts of violence. And, you can see it in subsequent administrations. So Kenyatta, one of his first acts as president is to start an incursion into the Northern Frontier District. Moi does the same thing, and there's even what is tantamount to a genocide, the Wagala massacre. Kibaki, who is seen by most observers or a certain type of citizenry as a rather benign developmentalist president, also has an incursion, and it is the Uhuru administration is similar, and the current administration seems to be comfortable with the securitization of that area. So I think it is in the reading of how the state is willing to wield certain types of violence, and in part of a longer historical dimension, that we do see how that racialization takes place, at least internally, I think.
Yeah. So what you say is really interesting, because on the one hand, indeed, the Kenyan state inherited this sort of militarized approach, this use of force to pacify various parts of the country throughout their rule. And as you say, like even the state of emergency in the north remained. And I think this is a fact that a lot of Kenyans may not even be aware of long after flag independence. But let's come to you, Samar, and maybe you can walk us through the ways in which, even though there has always been that use of force within the country, Kenya has not always portrayed itself, and a lot of African countries have not necessarily always always moved through the world as interventionists. And the war on terror sort of broke that historical imperative, and now a lot of the countries on the continent, have their forces in other countries, whether quote unquote legally, and the legality of the UN Security Council and its edicts is something that we can talk about in a whole other video. But walk us a little bit through the sort of like the changing position on militarization and external intervention that the Kenyan that Kenya has gone through over the past couple of decades, especially in the wake of the war on terror.
Excellent. Yeah. And perhaps I can just respond briefly to Rene, because I think that history that he just outlined is so important for so many reasons. And one reason I would add is that, among US focused scholars of the war on terror, there's a tendency to assume that the US simply exports not only the technology and the training, but also the ideologies, right, to other places in the world, and that those other places across the global South passively receive all of those things, right? And that's simply not the case. And so what Rene has just outlined, whether we characterize it as a continuity or not, is perhaps less significant than characterizing it as less significant than acknowledging that history matters, right? That we must take it into account as we assess how Kenya has reached this state of playing such a prominent role and being able to get away with the kinds of violence that it does, right? So thank you again to Rene for outlining that, and now to bring us to the present day. Or perhaps less so the present day, because we have to rewind a bit historically in order to understand at the broader continental level how it became permissible, not only permissible, but even encouraged and respected to engage in the kind of militarized interventionism that Kenya now pursues and leads on the continent and beyond. So in the 60s and 70s, with the independence of African states and the emergence of what was once called the Organization of African Unity, today is called the African Union, there was a very, very strong commitment to non-intervention. And that commitment to non-intervention was informed by a deep, deep understanding of the potential for neocolonialism. And it was Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana who said, we have to be wary that the United States and other imperial actors may use some of our political leaders to intervene in the affairs of our fellow African states. And we need to be not only aware, but committed to preventing it. Now, that commitment to non-intervention fundamentally changed in the 1990s, late 1990s, I should say, at a time that came in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, when there was a sense of collective guilt that more was not done. This was also a time when we saw the emergence of the concept of the responsibility to protect, which many African states were supporting. And it was at that time that we saw the shift away from the Organization of African Unity to what we now have in the form of the African Union, wherein suddenly we saw this rhetoric of precisely that responsibility to protect come to the fore, such that the principle of non-intervention disappeared as something that African states continued to be committed to. And so that is when African states like Kenya are able to conveniently obscure their own histories of violence, while at the same time promoting themselves as quote unquote peaceful, promoting themselves as stable and as the source of stability elsewhere on the continent. And so what I describe in the book is the way in which Kenya positions itself as exceptional with respect to its neighbors, whom it then reifies these racialized notions of African states as being inherently violent and inherently unstable by positioning itself as different, as distinct, and as capable of bringing peace. So that shift has then enabled not only the ability of Kenyan states to intervene in Somalia in 2011 and now to take this role in Haiti, but it has enabled massive spending increases in the military equipment, etc. And there was one other element that I wanted to bring up. That is that alongside these dynamics happening on the African continent, you have an ideology within the U.S. military. There's a shift in kind of understanding about what the U.S. is prepared to do, what it's prepared to take on. And this is deeply informed by the losses of U.S. troops we could go as far back as Somalia, actually, in the early 1990s. Then we could look at Iraq and Afghanistan and the failure of those military occupations. And along with that kind of assessment of failures, the U.S. military started to say, okay, we need to have light footprint deployments of U.S. forces, in places where we're engaged, to avoid the loss of our own troops, to avoid the potential for any kind of legal accountability, and to prevent backlash from Americans, right, in response to the death of U.S. troops. And so corresponding to that commitment to light footprint is then an investment in training and equipping, in the African case, African troops, so that they're the ones on the front lines doing the dying, and the U.S. doesn't have to pay the price. And the other element that's happening here is that the U.S. is less and less interested in, and I think this played a role in the Haiti deployment as well, the U.S. is less and less interested in multilateral operations, multilateral deployments. Why? Because they take too long. They're very, very interested in what they refer to as flexible deployments, the ability to just respond quickly. And this is where governments like Kenya and Rwanda, who have been very strategic in seizing upon that shift and saying, we're ready to deploy, in a moment's notice. So this is all the more reason why I argue in the book, we need to be paying attention not only to U.S. strategy, but to the ways in which African political leaders are also seizing upon these political dynamics and these shifts.
There's so much you've said there that we can dig into. And so my mind is buzzing. But let me come back to you, Rene, with one of the most poignant points that Samar has made about Kenya's exceptionalism. I mean, we all grew up learning about Kenya being this island of peace amidst all these other nations that are at war. We are the civilized Africans, while all the other Africans are, barbarians at civil war. But that is clearly has not been true, even by the history you laid out about our cousins in the north. That has never been true for them. Not even, not before flag independence and not after flag independence. They have never lived in that island of peace. However, we are having this conversation today at a very specific moment in Kenya's history, where the state's reaction to the way that the people's uprising that we have been seeing over the past year or so, the state's reaction has made the invisible visible to the majority of Kenyans. So a lot of the tactics that Samar describes in her book that are used by the security apparatus to against so-called terrorists, in neighborhoods that are Muslim, whether it is Isili or in Mombasa or other parts of the country, are now being used against the average citizen. So walk us through this sort of is it even an aha moment? What are you going to call it? This moment where Kenyans are just like, these new things are happening. And a lot of people are telling them, this is not new. So walk us through the security apparatus that was set up specifically to respond to the war on terrorism within and outside our borders, and how it is being deployed against our very own, and the way that this is sort of changing the narrative around militarization across the country.
Okay. I'm going to say one thing I'm going to say a problematic thing next.
Go for it.
I'll say the problematic thing next. In her book on forced migration in East Africa, I believe that's the title, there's a political scientist of refugee studies called Cassandra Vini who analyzes Kenya's foreign refugee policy for the most part as being an exceptionalist policy in and of itself. Kenya has always viewed the refugee problem as we don't produce them. And even when we have problems in our country, what we produce is internally displaced persons. They're all in free area in Nakuru. They don't cross the border. So why are there Ugandans in Kakuma? You know, why are there Somalis in Dadaab? It's why are there South Sudanese? You know, it's Kenya has always treated the refugee problem in a particular sense that's their problem. The UNHCR will deal with it, and then they'll all get resettled in Minnesota and Sweden. We don't have to be involved, which is why every so often when Kenya wants to strong arm the international community, and you'll remember this with the former Minister of Interior, they would threaten to close down refugee camps, which is a thing they had even done in the past with the refugee camps along the Kenyan coast and so forth. So Kenya's refugee policy, Kenya's administrative policies also tend to reflect that exceptionalism that happens on the ground. But then the ground is also an interesting place, which is where I'm about to say the heretical thing. Because if you're Kenyan and you know this because you're Kenyan, and anytime the state is showing immense amounts of weakness, you will quickly hear people say, this isn't Somalia. You can't do that here. This isn't Uganda.
Yeah.
Right? And so in the moment of uprising, I think the uprising in Kenya, and I think I can say this with a reasonable amount of property, that actually the people's uprising we're seeing in Kenya is actually another opportunity for Kenyan exceptionalism, because the discourse has quickly become, maneno kama haya haiwezi fanyika Tanzania. Tanzanians cannot do this. Yeah. Ugandans can't stand up to Museveni. Yes. Only Kenyans can pull down a finance bill, can bully their president out of Twitter, it's only Kenyans who can do these things. And so obviously a weird reverse effect has occurred, where even in the moment of suffering, Kenyans are still better than other people. We might be having a bit of an autocratic government, but at least it speaks English. It's a weird thing to be. Nationalism is a weird. Patriotism tends to be a strange thing in these scenarios, which then, one, I think, robs us of a moment of certain types of solidarity, right? I think it robs us of certain moments of solidarity, but I shall not dwell on that too long. But I think it also places the population at a very strange position when it comes to understanding what it is that they're facing. If you'd been paying attention, the militarization that is going on in the middle of the CBD on July 7th looks a little bit too much like the ones that happened on the Mombasa-Lamu highway. It's not a TPU. It's some type of GSU that you've not seen in a while. Kenya did not need to import new types of police technologies. They just, what have you been doing in Mandera? Come and do it in Nairobi. Just come for this day, July 7th, do it in Nairobi. And it harkens a little too much to Cesare's imperialist boomerang. However, I do think that, there have always in Kenya been stories of the killer cop. It wasn't until there was, when it was in broad daylight, that people started going like, this cannot happen in Kenya, this is not Uganda. It's always been happening in Kenya. There's stories of lone wolf. I forget the name of the police officer. I believe his name was Ian someone. I forget the name.
I think he was actually released. I think the charges against him were dropped literally yesterday. The guy in Isili.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. These sorts of infrastructures have existed and have long life worlds of their own. There has always been the rogue killer cop, going back all the way into the 60s. You might decide to go back even as far as the war on Mau Mau, where there was, Ian Henderson would just walk into the forest and shoot whoever he saw on sight. These sorts of, they have always existed. I don't think that the exceptionalist narrative that Kenyans craft for themselves is the reason why they exist. But I do think, being the country that has been the darling of the West, you might imagine, for instance, you might call to mind, I believe it is the American ambassador 2 weeks ago, saying, anytime America wants to do something in Africa, we start in Kenya first. Yep. We might call to mind things like those. Of course, that means setting up a regional headquarters for Google, but it also means good old boots on the ground imperialism and disappearances in the streets, and these kinds of technologies being recycled back into a country that speaks of itself as toughening up its security apparatus. So that is why you will hear the former Minister for Interior, as part of his campaign strategy, saying June 25th would never have happened if he was, because he knows the security apparatus of the country. He knows our capacity. So this would never have happened if he were Minister for Interior. You might want to take that a little bit seriously, because there's a through line between that and shoot to kill orders being spoken of so lightly in a country that otherwise boasts of not possessing those things.
Yeah, but then even though the exceptionalism does not lead to, is not a direct relationship between the exceptionalism and the use of this apparatus, there is a relationship between the exceptionalism and the blindness of the majority of Kenyans to those subaltern populations on whom this security apparatus is used on a daily basis. And that's why a lot of Kenyans were showing up very shocked that who are these plainclothes policemen bundling people into vehicles? Plainclothes policemen have been bundling people into vehicles for decades.
For decades. It's part of the storyline of Nairobi Half-Life. These are things that are even consumed as part of, it's fiction. Not really. Or you just need to take one small matatu ride into Isili and you will hear people talking about lives that sound not too far away from a state of emergency, where you have to walk with your ID card and, so on and so forth, and that people will shoot to kill. Police officers will shoot to kill at moment's notice. And if we had been paying attention and not just securitizing and everything and going like, it makes sense when you have curfews in the northeastern part of the country. That definitely makes sense. Just don't do it in Nairobi. We don't do that here since the days of Operation Anvil. And I do think that there is definitely a through line of a sort. Yes, I definitely do think so.
Absolutely. And so staying on that same subject, but now exactly what you mentioned, one of my favorite concepts, the boomerang effect, variously attributed to Foucault. You said Césaire. I didn't know Césaire had also written about the boomerang effect.
Discourse on colonialism.
Okay. So let's come back to you, Samar, because what we were seeing on the streets. So just to go back to what you said about what the American ambassador to Kenya said just 2 weeks ago, that whenever they want to do something in Africa, they do it first in Kenya. But in reality, empire, even the core of empire, first experiments outside of itself before those very methods of violence and repression and pacification are turned back onto the very population from which they came. So over the last, since Trump came back into power, we've seen the same thing, pretty much the same things we were seeing on the streets of Nairobi over the past couple of months happening in the United States. We've been seeing, and you go on Twitter and you have the same sort of reaction we were just describing about your average Kenyan who is shocked and says, what new things are this happening? And it's like, no, those are not new. They've been happening to other people. And now you have all these Americans saying, who are these plainclothes people? How can ICE show up and, in schools and in homes and, into these sacred and private spaces and conduct, what are essentially security exercises? Very much akin to what empire has been funding on its periphery, if you're going to call Kenya a periphery as a sub-imperial nation. But yeah, please tell us a little bit about the ways in which this is, this training ground has prepared America for its sort of like, I'm not going to call it the onset of fascism because that would be too rich. I think fascism has been there for a while. But how exactly is this playing out in America right now?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. And if we think about Césaire, right, and this notion of the boomerang effect, it has so much resonance for the current moment with Trump. And what comes to mind for me specifically is the deployment of plainclothes ICE officers, right? So people working for Customs and Border Control who are not uniformed, who are not operating in clearly marked vehicles. The parallels between what is happening on the streets of Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., all across the country today, and what Kenya has been experiencing for so many years, right? And so as Rene points out, this is not something new for Kenya either. we have to be making those connections. And it is precisely one of the core objectives of empire to prevent us from seeing those connections, from making those connections, right? That is a very, very integral element of its power. And so one of our jobs as scholars, as thinkers, as activists, is to think about how and why people and places who are similarly subjugated by similar forms of power and control and strategies of pacification that circulate across borders, how and why we don't think of our struggles as connected, right? Like, how have we been socialized? How have we been brainwashed into thinking of our struggles as separate? And as Rene mentioned, nationalism is one important element of that. But we can also think about how within countries, people, similarly, due to race, ethnicity, gender, etc., those divisions also remain. And the second point that I want to make, and that I kind of tease out in the conclusion of the book, where I talk about Kenya's decision to lead this multinational police operation in Haiti, is that we need to expand our understanding of this idea of imperial laboratory away from the center periphery model, right? Because that's the tendency. Historically, scholars are thinking about core periphery transmission of technologies of pacification and control. But what we're seeing now with Kenya, much like Brazil before it, is that even countries in the global south are using other sites within the global south as a site of experimentation. So Brazil, 10 years ago, sent troops to Haiti, and it was viewing Haiti as an experimental ground to develop, fine-tune its counterinsurgency strategies to then deploy on its own population back home. And so in the conclusion of the book, I'm hinting that the Kenyan government may similarly have those kinds of objectives, right? That this is a training ground for Kenyan police to learn, from the, what, we might characterize as a more complex, quote unquote, security situation, and to then transfer what it learns onto its own population back home. So we need to be thinking about these circulations in slightly more complex ways.
Yeah. So I do want us to actually go, speak more about the ways in which solidarity and how we think about solidarity needs to change in the context of seeing these manifestations of counterinsurgency circulating across these various strata of empire. But before we do, I would really like you, Samar, to give, for a lot of our audience is Kenyan, and they may not necessarily understand when we speak of the security infrastructure that emerged outside of that emerged as a result of this localized war on terror, and the ways in which it is being used even on our very own streets today. So speak a little bit about the relationship between, U.S. support for the war on terror and the emergence of sort of the legislature around terrorism and the insecurity infrastructure to sort of carry out the groundwork of that legislation, so that our viewers better understand the relationship between, empire and what we're seeing on our very own streets with people being bundled up by, plainclothes men into vehicles.
Yeah, so we could take 1998 as a starting point in the aftermath of the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. So even though this precedes 9/11, that was a critical moment for the U.S. because that was when Al-Qaeda first emerged as this global network that the U.S. felt threatened by. And so it immediately dispatched FBI. It was actually the largest deployment of FBI investigators outside of U.S. national territory historically up until that point. They sent them to both Kenya and Tanzania. And in addition to the Muslim population in both countries being on the receiving end of very, very harsh policing tactics, we started to see pressure on both governments to cooperate with the U.S. on security matters. And I think it's worth noting that it wasn't an immediate the Kenyan officials were not immediately receptive. It took some time for them to warm up to the idea, along with succumbing to pressure. And it was a huge amount of pressure because both the US and the UK governments imposed travel restrictions on Kenya until they agreed to introduce legislation in parliament that was virtually, the same rhetoric and language as used in the US Patriot Act. And it's worth noting, if I may be feeding into this Kenyan exceptionalism here that Rene is resisting when it comes to Kenyan resistance, but it is worth noting, the extent to which activists were really, really standing their ground in resisting these laws. And I attribute the fact that it took until 2012 for that law to pass very much to, how vocal civil society and activists were in Kenya, because in contrast, there was a very clear contrast with Tanzania and Uganda, where legislation passed virtually right away. So since that time, with or without the legislation, we know that the Kenyan security apparatus has done what it wanted. So, that's where the law is not necessarily, we shouldn't be placing all of our weight on the law. And hundreds of millions of dollars began to pour in to expand the Kenyan security apparatus. And we could just take the period of 2010 to 2020, and this is simply one figure among many, and only one US agency among many that's providing funds. But the State Department provided, it was the DoD that provided $400 million in assistance. And so we started to see the rise of these specialized, quote unquote, counter-terror units like the Anti-Terror Police Force, as well as the Rapid Response Team, which is a CIA-trained and equipped body, and specifically CIA trained in order to evade accountability within US law, precisely for these kinds of arrangements. And as most of the Kenyan listeners will know, the impact of this kind of empowering of the Kenyan security apparatus has just been devastating in terms of the extrajudicial killings, the disappearances that have occurred. And the one final point I'll make is in the realm of telecommunications and surveillance, where the U.S. National Security Agency has worked very closely with telecommunications companies like Safaricom to surveil the Kenyan population. And that has been integral to the ability of the police to track down, effectively to hunt, and in many cases kill, quote unquote, suspects.
On that note, on that rather depressing note, over the last couple of months, we've seen the fervor for protest really fading on the streets. I think especially the Kenyan young people, are emotionally and psychologically exhausted by all the deaths they have seen, the news of disappearances day in, day out, and just this sense that what we are pushing against, at least with the methods that we're using at the moment, we may not get the outcomes that we seek if we continue pushing in this way. And so a lot of the attention has now turned on the elections. So the idea is that if we cannot get rid of a government that has clearly been rejected by the people by just the popular will of showing up on the streets, then let us remove them via what has been called a ballot revolution. At least the terminology ballot revolution is being thrown around quite a bit recently. And some of the leading presidential, at least aspirants who have shown some intent to run for Kenya's presidency, especially those who sit outside of the establishment, are running almost entirely on the concept of the rule of law. But the rule of law is a concept we have inherited from the colonial administration. And it has a very sort of like, it has had a very clear impact on the way in which we think of ourselves and we think of governance in the country. And that has led to sort of like even this sort of centralization of the constitution as the tool through which Kenyan liberation is going to be realized. But without saying too much about it, Rene, I want to come back to you to give us your position and your thinking around the concept of rule of law as being as being what is missing to set Kenyans free, its limitations, its extent and its limitations, and what you would hope for if that is not what you, if that's not the rhetoric that you're going for, what would you be going for in a potential leader in Kenya?
Disciplinarily, I'm a historian, so I'm afraid of making predictions. I wish I were a political scientist. Political scientists are very good at making predictions of things after they've already happened. I will think back to something I saw somewhere at a gathering somewhere where the former Chief Justice was speaking, and of course, he has been fronted by certain people who have taken the mantle upon themselves as the leaders of the Gen Z revolution. And the person we need to go with is the former president of the Supreme Court of Kenya, because he is the first person in Africa to annul a presidential election. He annulled a presidential election. He has a certain measure of integrity. If you look back to his confirmation hearings, the matter that sails him over the edge, over the bar, tended to be the question of integrity, his integrity. And so you will look at his campaign slogan, restore, rebuild, reestablish, something like that. It's restore. And of course, if you're a certain type of Kenyan from a certain part of the country, you should ask, restore what exactly? And so he was speaking somewhere, and a Kenyan asked him, you speak about the rule of law. Kenyans have been killed legally in this country. We have seen that legislators can legislate laws to dispossess. We have seen that when if it is illegal for a politician to trade on something and there's a conflict of interest, they can rewrite the Conflict of Interest Act, etc. And the response, pitiably, ended up being another resort to the rule of law. And when the former president of the Supreme Court of Kenya tells you about the rule of law, you must assume he knows what he's talking about. After all, he owns a horsehair wig somewhere. But I think that should point Kenyans to a different level of class analysis. And that is where we look at the judicial class as a class in and of itself. And the judicial class in Kenya has tended to be a very conservative class. And I do not mean that in terms of the letter of the law, because, Kenyan lawyers are beautiful in the sense that they say such things as, the law is very clear. Then they bicker for 3 hours about that law that they assured us was rather clear. It is that the Kenyan judicial class, you will never see them snap back as fast as when they see their own heads on the chopping block. So you do not see, for instance, much furrow of, say, whatever other weird legislation is being done, as when you see a BBI bill, that the Building Bridges Initiative bill, that threatens the integrity of the judicial class. Then they go like null and void. When I'm not a killer of hopes. But when I look at a former Supreme Court justice running on the rule of law, what I'm hearing is, as someone in the judicial class, my interests are now being threatened by an autocratic government. Now something needs to be done about it. There are perhaps other reasons, and perhaps I will say, of everybody else, I am least scared perhaps of Maraga's candidature, simply because the other person who's being frontlined is the former deputy president of this administration, or the former minister of interior, who stood in front of Harambee House holding live bullets in his hands, saying police have killed nobody, while Baby Pendo lay dead from bullets that were shot into a balcony. What is a horrible saying? Politics is the art of washing your hands with dirty water. So if we must pick the least worst option,
it is going to be the rule of law guy.
Yeah.
But this is your opportunity to tell me what sort of leader, or what sort of driving mandate would you want your dream presidential candidate to have within this dispensation?
Yes. Well, much like everything else in my life, I do not know what I want. I know what I do not want. I do not want the kind of characteristics that we impute on who should be an effective Kenyan leader. And that often tends to be, we want a disciplinarian. We want a good dictator, you will hear Kenyans say. No, I do not want someone who talks down to Kenyans and tells and releases security machinery upon them constantly, which is what everybody who's fronting their names on the ballot say, perhaps except Boniface Mwangi, who just announced his bid yesterday. Has a track record of that, and the former Chief Justice. I do not want a naked developmentalist who believes that the only way to improve the country is to dispossess people of their land in order to put an expressway on it or a railway through it. Or, I know what I do not want. And unfortunately, nobody who's currently throwing their hat in the ring speaks in any other way other than that. I will root out corruption by shooting so and so. I know that I'm not looking forward to that. In terms of what I am looking forward to as a Kenyan of voting age who in certain scenarios believes in the power of the ballot, I simply do not know. And we don't know what this moment is going to give us. That is, we think it will either give us a bad president or a good president. It might give us a secret third thing that is perhaps in some ways better or in some ways worse. I simply do not know, and I feel immensely incompetent when it comes to such a question.
That was the hedging of a historian that we have just had. But on that note, I want us to come to the end of this, what has been a truly wonderful conversation. But Samar, I want to come to you because what I loved about your book is its insistence on not dwelling on the pain and the violence and the sort of like helplessness that one reads in books like this that describe when you have this, this heavy machinery of violence raining down on people who are relatively helpless. So I really did appreciate the fact that in your book, you did humanize people. You did give nuance to their lives and color to the way in which they're even approaching joy in the context of such pain. So I want us to end on that note. But what I'd really like for you to sort of lay out is a sort of like a utopian vision for this sort of global solidarity network that would start to understand that these differentiations between the periphery and the core and the subaltern populations in those do not quite exist the way we think that they do, and that what our cousins in Gaza are experiencing today is pretty much what is being experienced by a Latina family in Los Angeles today, which is being experienced in Githurai. And there's this similarity and the forces that are acting upon all these people are pretty much the same. So maybe as you were writing this book, you must have had some sort of utopian ideal of how these people could all work together towards something that looks different than what we're experiencing today.
Yes. So I, as I was writing the conclusion, which again is about the decision for Kenya to deploy police to Haiti, one of the things that was very much on my mind and that I conclude the very, last kind of paragraph with is it really speaks to the limits of power, to the limits of imperial power, especially. And by that, I mean that the Kenyan political leadership class, the US political leadership class, can try all they want to divide, right? And to employ rhetoric that divides. And the decision to deploy police to Haiti is one example of the potential to divide, wherein you're pitting the Kenyans against the Haitians, right? Where the Kenyans are there to police, to monitor, to surveil, to pacify the Haitians. And yet, in order to justify the deployment, Kenyan political leaders had to invoke the history of the Haitian slave revolt. And they invoked it in the name of Pan-Africanism, claiming that the Kenyan deployment was also in the name of Pan-Africanism. But there is a risk that comes with that invocation of history, right? It opens a door for Haitians and Kenyans alike to begin learning more about each other's histories. And in learning more about each other's histories, they are inevitably inclined to unite. right, to come together in solidarity as they see the connections between the forms of oppression and exploitation that they have experienced. And so I end the book on that hopeful note, saying that, it is, well, we're already seeing, right, people coming together, at least in online formats and webinars, precisely to make those connections between those histories of struggle and to resist collectively this newest form of militarized interventionism and imperialism. So that gives me hope. And I think the final point I'll make is that it is rarely, if ever, people in positions of power who have the creativity, who have the imagination to conceive of and build new worlds. Right. And what is needed now at this time is not a reproduction of the same, whether it's in Kenya, whether it's in the United States, in terms of the kinds of leaders that we need and the kinds of ideas that we need. We need people who have a sense of imagination. And I think historically, it is those who are most on the most direct receiving end of oppression and imperial violence that are daring to dream of new worlds.
That is a very beautiful note on which to end. Thank you so much, Samar Al-Bulushi. Kenyans, you can find her book at Cheche Bookshop, War Making as World Making. I don't know if it's in Nuria Bookshop as well.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, but Cheche Bookshop I know because that's where I got my copy. And thank you so much, Rene Odanga. I got that right.
Yes, you did.
Okay, great. We'll cut out this bit. This was a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much. Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
All right, we'll see you soon.